A soldier lighting a match at nearly 20,000 feet just to feel his own fingers again. Tank crews driving blind through smoke so thick the sky simply disappeared. Men crawling through sewers to kill each other one room at a time, one floor at a time for months on end. An entire city reduced to breadlines measured in grams, while winter finished off what the artillery had started. This is the story of the 10 battles where combat stopped being just a question of tactics and turned into a war against the planet itself, against cold, heat, altitude, starvation, and geography, all conspiring at once against men just trying to survive until the next day. This isn't a list about who had the best weapons or the best generals. It's a list about raw endurance, about what happens when an entire army has to win 2 wars at the same time, one against the enemy and one against the place where the fighting happened. Some of these names you'll already know. Others you probably haven't heard, even though they were just as brutal, sometimes more so. And fair warning right now, in more than one of these battles, the environment killed more soldiers than the enemy in front of them did. Above 20,000 feet, the air holds so little oxygen that a soldier can pass out just from standing still too long. That's exactly where India and Pakistan chose to fight, on the Siachen Glacier, the highest battlefield in military history, higher than most commercial jets fly. Helicopters could barely get supplies up to that altitude, and every extra pound carried up meant a disproportionate amount of effort, often requiring days of manual hauling across unstable ice trails where a single wrong step could mean a fall into a hidden crevasse. Frostbite could claim fingers and toes in minutes, not hours. Tents got buried by avalanches in the middle of the night without warning, burying soldiers who had just finished their watch and crawled into their sleeping bags. Altitude sickness, pulmonary edema, cerebral edema, killed men who had never even laid eyes on an enemy soldier, men who essentially died from the geography itself. Observation posts sat cut off for weeks at a time whenever bad weather closed the supply routes, and during those stretches soldiers had to ration everything: food, fuel for warmth, even physical effort itself, because every movement burned oxygen that barely existed up there. But here's the number that sums up the whole conflict. Over the years of fighting, far more soldiers died from avalanches, altitude sickness, and cold exposure than from actual combat. 2 nations went to war over an isolated strip of ice, and most of the time, the ice itself won. But if Siachen was a war against extreme cold at altitude, the next battle on this list went to the opposite end of the thermometer. In the Egyptian desert in 1942, daytime temperatures soared and sandstorms could swallow an entire column of tanks in seconds, dropping visibility to almost zero while engines overheated and seized up at full throttle. Water was rationed sip by sip. Every soldier knew exactly how much he could drink and when, and mismanaging a single canteen could mean the difference between making it through the shift or collapsing mid-firefight. Montgomery's 8th Army faced off against Rommel's Afrika Korps in a battle that would decide who controlled North Africa and, by extension, access to Middle Eastern oil. Both sides were fighting a second enemy the entire time, the desert itself, which didn't take sides. Vehicles broke down faster than they could be repaired, engines frying inside metal exposed to direct sun. Artillery pieces got too hot to touch without gloves. Men fought dehydrated, disoriented, half-blind from blowing sand, and still had to calculate trajectories, distances, and firing angles with surgical precision, because a single mistake under those conditions cost lives instantly. Minefields stretched for miles, forcing entire columns to advance through narrow corridors under crossfire, all of it under a sun that gave zero relief from dawn to dusk. El Alamein wasn't just a tactical victory. It was a victory for whoever could outlast the heat longer than the other side. If El Alamein was brutal because of heat with nowhere to hide from it, the next battle went to the exact opposite extreme, and it may have broken more men than any other climate on this list. Temperatures at the Chosin Reservoir in the winter of 1950 dropped to nearly -35 degrees Celsius, with wind chill pushing it even lower. Rifles jammed because the lubricating oil froze solid inside the mechanism itself, turning firearms into useless chunks of metal at the exact moment they were needed most. Morphine syrettes had to be warmed in a medic's mouth before they could even be injected, because the liquid froze somewhere between the pocket and the wound. Canned rations froze so hard they had to be thawed over small fires before anyone could eat them, when there was time and fuel to spare for that. Entire units suffered frostbite before a single shot was even fired, losing feeling in feet inside boots that no longer protected against anything. American and UN forces found themselves surrounded by a much larger Chinese army, in freezing mountains, in the dark, in cold that killed almost as efficiently as bullets did. The retreat that followed became legendary, not because it was a victory in the traditional sense, but because thousands of men fought their way out of a complete encirclement, carrying their wounded, while the cold itself tried to finish what the enemy couldn't. But not every extreme battle on this list comes down to weather. Some are about sheer scale, and the next one packed more armored steel into a single place than the world had ever seen before, or since. Kursk, 1943. Thousands of tanks converged on a single stretch of Soviet ground in what remains the largest tank battle in history. Crews fought almost completely blind inside metal boxes filling up with smoke and the smell of burning fuel, with internal temperatures climbing to unbearable levels while engines ran non-stop. Sometimes tanks rammed enemy vehicles on purpose, at point-blank range, because there simply wasn't time to reload or aim carefully in the chaos. The scale was almost incomprehensible, armor stretching to the horizon in every direction. The ground itself turned into a wasteland of twisted metal, burning wrecks scattered for miles, the sky darkened by smoke from engines and exploding ammunition all at once. Ground attack aircraft dove on the armored columns on both sides, adding yet another layer of chaos to a battle that was already nearly impossible to coordinate. Kursk permanently broke Germany's ability to launch another major offensive on the Eastern Front. After this battle, strategic initiative shifted for good to the Soviet side, and it never shifted back. If Kursk was industrial-scale warfare on open ground, the next battle dragged soldiers into an environment where none of that mechanized power could help them at all. In the jungles of Guadalcanal, the environment itself was almost as lethal as the Japanese army. Malaria, dysentery, and starvation wore down both sides almost as fast as direct combat did, with soldiers losing weight and strength at a rate that turned simple tasks, like carrying gear, into a near-impossible effort. Marines fought in humidity that rotted their boots off within weeks and made even minor wounds infect almost instantly, in terrain so dense that entire units could lose contact with each other a few feet apart, swallowed up by vegetation that erased any real line of sight. Night ambushes were constant, and the simple act of sleeping became dangerous because the enemy knew that jungle just as well as the men defending it did. Naval battles raged offshore so often, and with such heavy losses that the surrounding waters earned the nickname Iron Bottom Sound, for all the ships sunk there, stacked on top of each other at the bottom of the sea. It was 6 months of grinding attrition in a green hell, where simply staying alive, day after day, was already its own daily victory. But scale was about to change entirely. The next battle on this list wasn't measured in months of jungle warfare. It was measured in a single day that redrew the map of an entire continent. On June 6, 1944, roughly 7,000 ships and landing craft, along with over 11,000 aircraft, converged on a single stretch of French coastline in what remains the largest amphibious invasion in history. Paratroopers had already jumped hours earlier, in the dark, often landing far from their intended drop zones, fighting alone or in scattered improvised groups before dawn even broke. Men waded through the water under machine gun fire coming from bluffs they often couldn't even see, pushing through obstacles specifically designed to gut landing craft in water that was sometimes already stained red before they'd even reached the sand. Gear weighed so much that wounded soldiers who went down in shallow water faced a real risk of drowning before anyone could even reach them. Entire units were essentially wiped out within minutes at Omaha Beach alone, where German defenses had been set up with lethal precision on the most exposed terrain of the entire operation. And yet the operation succeeded, not because it went according to plan, since almost nothing did, but because tens of thousands of individual soldiers kept moving forward anyway, one decision at a time, under constant fire. But while Normandy was about breaking into a continent by force, the next entry on this list is about a city that couldn't be broken into at all, because it was already being destroyed from within. 872 days. Nearly 2.5 years of a city under siege, cut off from food, fuel, and any real hope of quick relief. Civilians in Leningrad had their bread rations measured in grams per day, literally grams, with life and death decided on a bakery scale. During the harshest winter of the siege, entire families burned furniture, books, and wooden floorboards just to avoid freezing to death inside their own homes. The only supply route that remained crossed a frozen lake, nicknamed the Road of Life, a path just as dangerous as any front line, where trucks broke through thin ice along with everything they were carrying. Hundreds of thousands of people died, not on a conventional battlefield, but inside apartments, in bread lines, in the freezing dark of a winter with no heat at all, often without even the strength left to bury their own dead. And still, the city refused to surrender. Leningrad stopped being a battle in the traditional sense and became a test of how long an entire population could endure deliberate starvation before breaking, and the answer, brutally, turned out to be longer than anyone expected, at a staggering human cost. If Leningrad proved a siege could be fought and endured on land, the next battle on this list was fought almost entirely on water, and it remains the largest naval clash the world has ever witnessed. Leyte Gulf, 1944, the largest naval battle in history, fought across 4 simultaneous engagements spread over hundreds of miles of Pacific Ocean, so far apart that commanders in one engagement often had no idea exactly what was happening in the other 3 at the same time. Battleships designed decades earlier traded fire with modern aircraft carriers, in an almost surreal mashup of different eras of naval warfare playing out in the same theater at once. Submarines ambushed entire columns before the surface battle had even begun. And for the first time in an organized, deliberate way, Japan unleashed kamikaze attacks, pilots flying their own aircraft directly into Allied ships with no intention of surviving the mission, a tactic that made painfully clear just how desperate and total the war in the Pacific had become for the Japanese side. By the time it was over, the Japanese Navy had been effectively destroyed as an organized fighting force for the rest of the war, unable to mount any large-scale naval resistance ever again. But naval combat at that scale still has an escape route, the open sea itself. The next battle on this list gave the men fighting it absolutely nowhere to run for the better part of a year. 300 days. That's how long the Battle of Verdun dragged on in 1916, in a landscape reduced to cratered mud and splintered trees, under artillery bombardment so constant that soldiers described the ground itself as something that never sat still, shaking day and night without any real pause. Entire forts were reduced to twisted concrete ruins, and the front line sometimes moved only a few yards after weeks of non-stop fighting, with thousands of lives spent to gain ground that would often be lost right back a few weeks later. Soldiers reported never really sleeping because even far from the most active line, the sound and shudder of the artillery reached for miles, day after day, without ever really stopping long enough to let anyone rest. Roughly 700,000 men were killed, wounded, or listed as missing over those 10 months, fighting over a stretch of French territory that by the war's end had barely changed hands at all. Verdun became the defining symbol of attritional warfare, a battle where the goal, openly stated by German commanders themselves, wasn't to capture ground, but to bleed the enemy dry. And horrifically, that strategy worked on both sides at once, chewing through an entire generation of young men from both countries. And yet even Verdun's 10 months of slaughter only ranks second on this list, because the single most brutal battlefield in modern history combined nearly every extreme already covered here, and then went even further. Cold that could freeze exposed skin in minutes. Close quarters combat so tight that soldiers fought floor by floor inside the same building, sometimes room by room, in what troops grimly nicknamed the Rattenkrieg, the Rat War, where a single building could change hands multiple times in a single day, and where the front line wasn't a line at all, just a jumble of floors and stairwells held by whoever hadn't been pushed out yet. And death could come from any direction, at any moment, from above, from below, straight through a wall. Snipers fought over specific ruins for days on end, turning every broken window into a potential threat and making the simple act of crossing an open street a genuine gamble with your life. Above ground, bombing raids had already reduced most of the city to rubble before the close quarters fighting even truly began, which ironically made the terrain even better suited for ambushes and close combat, since every pile of debris became a defensive position. Civilians who hadn't managed to escape in time got trapped in the middle of it all, sharing the same basements and ruins that sheltered soldiers from both sides, caught in a fight that had nothing left of a traditional front. Add starvation, encirclement, and a winter that killed just as efficiently as either army, and you get a casualty count that still stuns historians today, over 2 million dead, wounded, and missing by the time the battle finally ended. Stalingrad wasn't just another battle, it was practically every extreme on this list, altitude aside, happening at the same time, in the same place, for months on end. 10 battles. 10 different ways the planet itself joined the fight on one side or the other. Altitude, heat, cold, jungle, ocean, siege, and rubble. Some of these battles were won by whichever side had the better tactics, the better technology, or the better command. Others were won, simply, by whoever could outlast the conditions a few more days than the other guy. Not always because they were stronger, but because they were, somehow, more stubborn. Siachen proved you can wage a war against thin air itself, in a place where just breathing already cost energy. Chosin proved that cold can be turned into a weapon just as lethal as any rifle. Alamein proved the exact same thing about heat. Kursk showed the limit of what machines can take when packed together in large enough numbers. Guadalcanal and Leningrad proved that starvation alone can decide a war just as effectively as any army. And Stalingrad proved that when all of these extremes arrive at once, cold, hunger, total collapse, close quarters slaughter, a city in ruins, the result stops being just a battle. It becomes the benchmark every other brutal fight gets measured against afterward. Which brings us to the question historians are still arguing about, decades after every one of these battles ended. When the environment kills more people than the enemy does, who or what were these soldiers really fighting? And how many of those victories, deep down, weren't won by any general at all, but simply by whoever was still standing once the cold, the hunger, or the altitude finally let up? 10 battles, 10 different battlefields, and in almost every single one, the harshest opponent wasn't wearing a uniform at all.